okay? But the second a gas that shouldn't be in there gets in there, okay, it allows it to react with that element, okay? The tungsten filament then has a tendency to rupture at high speed. When it ruptures at high speed, it will take out the glass around it if it's not built properly. So those Poundland ones actually have a habit of exploding. You then have to try and get the bayonet out the back of the fitting to put a new one in, okay? We can get them in a pearl finish or in a clear, okay? These types of lamps will operate in any position. They're easily dimmable. They don't require any specialist control gear to dim them, okay? And they're low cost. Application most commonly used domestically. You sometimes find them in some industrial places, but not very often, especially nowadays. Okay, any questions on these? Fantastic, okay? And also they're not the most eco-friendly one, because when we look at the efficiency, you get 12 to 18 lumens per watt of energy that you put into it, okay?
Was that efficiency, or was that efficiency?
Efficiency is the same sort
It's
of
the
thing.
same thing, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Halogens, okay, these now have the efficiency of 10 to 30 lumens per watt. Colour rendering index is 100, so they are very good for colour, okay. It does say that they will operate in any position. That doesn't include the linear ones, okay. The linear ones must be installed horizontally. It's because of the way these halogen ones work is that the halogen gas and the I think it's argon or something like that, helps to recoat the metal after it's been used. And what happens is that if it's put at an angle, the gas doesn't sit in there evenly. So when it recoats the metal after use, it ends up creating a weak point towards the top of the bulb, and it will cause it to shorten the life expectancy of that lamp if it's not installed horizontally. The reality is nowadays you can get a direct LED conversion kit for them now, okay, which will last a lot longer. They reckon that these types of lamps have a life expectancy of 2,000 to 4,000 hours. Okay, has anyone ever installed any of these before? Yep. Did you make sure you wore gloves? Didn't touch the lamp? Okay. The one thing about the quartz glass on this is that because of how hot this gets, your grease from your finger is enough to halve the life expectancy of these lamps. Okay. It's because your grease sits on top of the lamp and it will create a cooking point. That cooking point will create micro fractures in the glass, allowing oxygen inside. Once oxygen gets inside, the lamp dies. Okay, because it can't get to the highest temperature that it could. Okay, and that's all because you've touched it with your bare fingers. Okay, so you have to make sure that you don't touch them. And also, the other recommendation is don't touch them after they've been on for a little bit. They get hot. If you want to take your fingerprints off, they're fantastic for it. These are quite often used in floodlights, security lighting, because they're very bright for their size. Okay, any questions?
Are LED lights the best lights on the market at the moment then?
What it is about the efficiency and the running cost. Your running cost of an LED is half the price of most other lighting. So at that point, the running cost is halved. The problem you've got is depending on the cost of manufacturing behind it, depends on the life expectancy. So in this PowerPoint, they give you a fantastic life expectancy, but if you all think about the cheap ones we all buy, they never last that long. The reason for that is because of standard of manufacturing behind them. You can get, I think it's the Philips Hue LEDs, they cost you £50 a lamp. They will last 20 to 30 years, but you're paying £50 for one lamp. Okay? Whereas most of us, including me, I go buy the cheapest one out of B&Q. I never go for the Poundland ones. You might just kill yourself with them. I get the B&Q ones. You get about 2-3 years out of them, and then they burn themselves out. Okay. Right, mercury vapour. These are our fluorescent tubes. Okay. Does anyone here still have mercury vapour tubes in their houses?
Can't you get them shaped like a D? They call them
Yes.
D lights. They come in different shapes. Yeah.
Oh, got one in the garage.
Got one in the garage. They are more efficient than having an incandescent lamp. Okay, but the one thing, if you start looking at them and if you come to replace them, they are starting to become a little bit harder and harder to replace because they're being phased out as everything is. Okay, the more expensive thing to replace it with is you can actually get a direct replacement tube. Okay, has anyone ever done one of those?
I've seen the LED line. Yeah.
They are actually really easy to do. It's just a case of you take the starter out and you put a blanking starter in and you just plug it in and twist it and it works. Okay. The great thing about if you do convert them to LED is they actually use less than half the electricity as they do when they were one of the low pressure tubes. Okay. How I've told the class before how they start. Are you all happy with how they work? Do you want me to run through again? Okay. So the current comes into the circuit and it comes to the ballast. Also, some people call it a choke. Okay. So if you remember that when we have a solenoid, okay, that coil of wire creates that large magnetic field, doesn't it? Okay. That large magnetic field is a large source of energy. It just sits there for the moment. Okay. The current comes past it and comes up to the cathode. The cathode starts off as a heating element. Inside these tubes is a mercury vapour, which is great when it's warm, but when it's cold, it's not very conductive. The warmer it gets, the resistance drops off to almost nothing. Okay? So this is now acting as a little heating element. So for this to work as a heating element, it's got to have a connection to neutral, hasn't it? So that's why it comes up and it comes to the switch starter. That switch starter has a piece of metal and a bimetallic strip that connects to it. Okay? That allows for it to make a connection at this point through to the other cathode and through to neutral. Okay, does that make sense so far? So once it started to warm up, you've got a heating element at both ends of the tubes, the cathodes. They're heating up the mercury. That starter, that bimetallic strip, bimetallic means that you've got two pieces of metal. When when a current goes through it, it starts to warm up. The two plates expand at different rates, which means it curves, and it will break the connection there. So when this breaks the connection here, okay, we've got this built up energy here, haven't we? Energy can't be created or destroyed, so that energy has to go somewhere. Okay, does this make sense so far? Okay, so that energy will try and dissipate through the circuit, and it's going to try and bridge the gap through the tube. Okay, does that make sense so far? So you've all seen it, where sometimes it takes a couple of goes before it actually starts up. That's because the mercury is not quite hot enough yet. So it'll take a couple of strikes, and what happens is it'll strike across here, this will cool down quite quick, and then it will reconnect through until it's got enough warmth inside that mercury vapour to have bridged the gap between the two cathodes. Okay, with me so far? So once it's connected through the two cathodes, that's the point of lowest resistance in the circuit. So electricity, it's like me as a child, you know. I'm fat for a reason because I'm a lazy fucker. So electricity is lazy, it takes the easiest route around the circuit. So it's not going to take the high resistance going around this way, is it? So it's now going to run the electricity through the fluorescent tube. The starter bit just sits there. It won't actually carry any current, but it will still be live. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So once that's bridged the gap, it's going to get hot, isn't it? When the resistance goes down, what happens to the current? Current goes up, doesn't it? So we have to have something there to limit that current flow. Okay, does that make sense? So that's why most people refer to the ballast as a choke, because it's actually self-regulating. As the circuit drops the resistance and it tries to allow more current to flow through, if you remember, when we have that coil of wire in that ballast, it generates electricity that flows in the opposite direction, doesn't it? So the more current that tries to go through it, the more current it creates that goes in the opposite direction to slow itself down. So you can see how it actually chokes the current down and limits it to a suitable running speed. Does that make sense? Fantastic, okay? And then the capacitor is there. Because of that coil of wire has that power factor, the capacitor has the opposite power factor, doesn't it? And it will cancel it out. Okay? Does that all make sense? Fantastic.
Why do we need, Jim, but why do we need starter? So if we take out the starter, so can we still lit the tube?
So if you remember, mercury will have a high resistance when it's cold. So if it's a cold tube, it will never bridge that gap. Because one, it needs the energy to build up to try and bridge the gap. And two, it needs that mercury to be warm. Okay? If you've ever been out in a garage after a frost and trying to start up a fluorescent tube, it can try and strike about 20 times because it's just not warm enough because of how cold it got. Okay? So that's why we need that starters. One, to allow the cathodes to act as heating elements, and two, to allow the ballast to build up that big magnetic energy to then try and release through when we break the connection. Okay? Does that all make sense?
So if someone said their fluorescent, there's a problem with their fluorescent light, and I turn the switch on, the light bulb just glows at each end, it's just glowing a little bit, that means there's a fault with the lamp. The lamp needs replacing?
Either the lamp or the starter would be where I start from.
If I turn the light switch on, the light flickers and doesn't strike up, is that telling me that the
Fluorescent tube.
tube's broken?
And if it's not lighting up and not doing anything at all, that would be the ballast that's gone.
Okay.
And the reality is, if the ballast has gone, I'd look at replacing the light fitting. Okay.
Can we check the ballast, like the multimeter?
Yes, you can check the input, make sure it's got voltage going to it, and you check the output.